Welcome everyone, Sego, Scano. Welcome to our online film screening of The Quilt of Belonging. And we're really excited today to have our curator, Patricia Dedman, and also the artist, the visionary behind The Quilt of Belonging, Esther Bryan, here with us to show the film screening. So welcome everyone. My name is Layla Black. I'm the marketing coordinator here at Woodland Cultural Center. Whenever we gather, whenever we come together, it is a tradition of the Haudenosaunee people to practice a state of gratitude and to practice our thankfulness. We typically start ceremonies off with our what's called the Thanksgiving address. And this Thanksgiving address is, it can actually be quite long, up to 20, 30 minutes, going through and giving gratitude for everything from the earth below our feet to the waters, working all the way up the trees, the greens, the animals, the food, the people here with us today. And no gathering starts without that very sacred address. And even though I myself don't know the Thanksgiving address, learning my language is something that is coming new to me. But I do want to start with my introduction because I'm quite proud as a Mohawk that I've learned how to introduce myself in the language. So Sego, Layla Black Yongyats, Anaware Niwagi Daroden, Ganyak Gehaga Niwago Wanjoden, Skanagoa. So basically I just said my name is Layla Black. I am of the Turtle Clan. I am Mohawk Nation and I'm from Six Nations. Welcome. And so I'm really excited that we have so many people here live. We are recording this as well, so we'll be able to send out the replay for anyone that missed the event. So I'm going to get myself out of the way. I would love to introduce to you our curator, who is passionate about art, and everything about the quilt has got us excited from installing it. We were so sad that it had to close, but we're excited that we can share it with you, at least a little bit of it digitally. So Patricia, I'm going to pass it over to you and get myself out the way, and you can welcome everyone here.
Okay, thanks, Layla. So welcome, everyone. I'm glad everybody can make it this evening. I'm so thrilled that Esther is able to join us tonight. The Quilt of Belonging, we were so excited to have it come in February, and we installed it in a day, and it was an amazing process. And then we closed the galleries 2 weeks later. So I'm so thrilled that we will be able to open up the galleries very, very soon. We are actually looking at possibly, fingers crossed, with hopefully August the 25th, which is the Tuesday. And we'll be going and opening it up at 10 o'clock in the morning till 3 with the time entry. So you have to phone the gallery and reserve your time. And following that, as usual in our COVID world, there'll be COVID protocols to follow. You'll have to go through a screening process, answer a few questions, wearing your mask, and doing social distancing. And Layla will post all of our protocols online so that you know what to expect when to come. And I'm so very excited to have Esther with us tonight. Amazing woman, visionary, artist, and this project means so much as it did when it first started, and I think it is just as, maybe as poignant, more so even today in the world that we live in. Multiculturalism was a key word, but now we live in a hashtag world of Black Lives Matter, hashtag, murdered and missing women, and it's all about community and diversity and having a place of belonging. And this quilt just embodies that. And when you come to the gallery and experience that, you are just enveloped. You are just kind of consumed by the quilt. It's just that kind of comforting feeling that you get when you're in the space. And you can spend hours, I know I do, looking at over the 263 blocks from every nation, including over 70 nations of First Nations people from across Canada. And of course, that also includes our 6 nations territories. And so the iconography that's relevant to each nation is prevalent, and the detail and the intensity of the blocks is just absolutely amazing. And so, Esther, I'm just going to ask you about the quilt and how you feel about how poignant it is today.
Well, it's so nice to be here, and I'm just honored to hear what you have to say about it. I think that, you know, when we made it, you mentioned that word multiculturalism, and it was just like, oh yeah, we just heard it so much, it was just a word after a while. But as the years have passed, and as we've come, particularly at this time, it takes on a really big significance. It's not just a word, it's a real thing. And the realization, sadly, that we have a long way to go. We thought that we had it all sewn up and we were very familiar with the term. But with this Black Lives Matter and others issues that have come up, we say, no, we still have a long way. We have to work at that. And this documentary was born out of the idea, yes, we have a book that describes the block, and it tells a little bit of the written story behind the block and the block maker. But it's still, what matters is everyone has a story, and it's one by one by one. It's your neighbor, your teacher, your child, your neighbor, you know, your grocer, whoever, and everyone has a story, and the quilt symbolizes listening to that story and getting to know people, and when you do, then learning to love that neighbor. And so this documentary is a sampling of stories, some First Nation, some Asian, African. We tried to spread it around the globe, a little bit from everywhere, as much as you can fit into 48 minutes. If we have been asked to do a documentary with all of them, and he said, how many days can you sit and listen? Because that's how long it would take. But it is symbolic that everyone's story matters. Everyone here tonight, your story matters, and mine. And my story is just the story that started it, but it is equally important to hear what you have to say about yourself.
Absolutely. So Layla, would you like to continue?
Sure. So I'll take over the technology side of things right now. I just want to remind everybody that is watching that there is a chat function. So Esther has been so gracious to actually stick around after the screening to answer any questions that you may have. And as something comes up as you watch the documentary, or maybe you just want to share a feeling, we would love to hear it. So use that chat feature as a way to communicate with us. So I'm going to get myself out of the way.
Can't hear you, Layla.
Also, one last thing, to mute your microphone. I did that before I told you to mute your microphone. So yes, just mute your microphone out so we don't get any background noise.
What is belonging? What does it mean to belong to a community, a country, to humanity? In 1998, artist Esther Bryan inspired a group of volunteers to create one of the largest symbols of belonging in Canada. The creation of the monumental textile art involved hundreds of people from Victoria to Newfoundland to the Arctic. From the small historic village of Williamstown, Ontario, Quilt of Belonging reached out to the communities of the world, in effect bringing together stories, ideas, and many cultures to show the world that there is hope and a place for all humanity.
When I had the idea, I knew that this was going to be an absolutely mammoth project, because if you want to talk about everyone, then you have to make everyone's there. That's going to make it large, just by its nature. Because we're a town of 250 people, and not a big community, and a fairly small community in terms of ethnic or cultural diversity, because we're basically a Scottish Celtic area. We have French and English and, you know, Swiss and Dutch farmers, but not a whole lot of diversity in the town. The fact that people open their hearts and were willing to go and learn about others and were eager to discover it and got more and more excited as they met new people and had to travel, had to leave the comfort of Glengarry to head out, and we're open to that and challenged by it. So the word started to spread out in the community. If you want to, this is what we want to do. We know it sounds impossible, but if you want to come, there's a place for you to work.
She was doing this project with all the countries, the people from the different countries who lived in Canada. But she said, I need all sorts of volunteers, and I need people in the office, and I need people to do answer the phone and do errands and do research and do mailing. And I said, whoa, back up, did you say research? And because I was retired from the library after 40 years, and I said, research, I can do that, because I can do that on my own, and I can come in. So I came in once a week with the research that I'd done during the week. But the first thing I had to do was find out which countries were represented in Canada. And I'd worked in the library in the children's department for over 30 years, and I had never really sat down and figured out. I knew there were lots of countries. I would have said, I don't know, maybe 75 or something like that. So I went through the immigration records. The immigration department were wonderful. They sent us all their big books of immigration. I went right back to the 1880s and went all the way through. It took 3 months to go through. And I finally went into Esther, and she kept saying, how's it going? Oh, I'm getting there, making this list, you know. So I finally went into her, and I said, well, I think I've got it all done. How many countries do you think is involved? And she said, oh, I don't know. I said, 192. Then she said, oh, she went white. She said, oh my goodness, it's going to be huge. How can we do this? And I said, well, I'm sorry. That's the answer, 192.
The idea of the quilt, you know, kind of was like a good stew. It was cooking for a long time in bits and pieces, but it came together when I went to Slovakia. I returned with my dad in 1994, who said to me, Esther, take me home. And I had no idea what he was talking about, because my dad's a missionary and we've lived all over the place. I was born in France and we moved, and I've never had a permanent home until I got married. So I said, home, where's home? Because Dad had never talked about it. He had hidden his past. I think it was too painful. It was, Slovakia was communist for almost 50 years, and he left at the end of the war. And so for him to bring that out was painful. And we went back to find his brother. Now you had two boys that were raised in the same family, but it had 50 years of different experience. One under repression, one under freedom, you know, and you could see that there was a bond. In a way, we were all family. It was emotional time of reunion, and yet you could see the impact of the lives they had lived and how that had formed who they were. And so I began to realize that whether we think it or not, first of all, the roots, the parts of our past, really inform who we are today. We may not be conscious of it, but the values that we get, the way we look at life, our personalities are formed by what has come before.
Britt Leppa was involved early in the making of this textile art. For her, it was important to be part of a project in which she could celebrate her Swedish roots while being a proud member of the Canadian family.
My husband was a captain on the Swedish-American line, the ocean liners. He was never at home. I was alone with the children, and it was hard on him. He missed us so much that it was really a challenge. So he was offered a position in Montreal Harbor as a shore captain there, and we decided to move to Canada. Settled in Montreal, and home, away from home, became the Norwegian Seaman Church, where we could meet with other Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, and a lot of sailors. My roots are still in Sweden. I often feel that I'm like a cut-off flower, and I'm put in a very beautiful vase, and that vase is Canada, because it's fantastic. But my roots are still in Sweden. Taking that little trip up to Williamstown in the beginning, when this all started, as often as I could, really, I went up there to see how it was growing and what was coming out of it. And all the people I met that got together, and we were all so amazed. We were all so amazed just to be a part of it. It was overwhelming.
Esther's trip to her father's home in Slovakia started her search for her own roots.
And it came back, brought back pieces that had been given me there. When you meet somebody after years, the thing that you want to do is give gifts or give pieces. The pieces that were given to me in Slovakia that were so precious were pieces of textile. Somehow they kept doing this beautiful needlework through the difficult years, through war, through rape, through the difficult things that happened. So I put them all together: photography, handmade paper, family photographs, scraps of fabric, painting, writing, to try and catch all these lost years and to try and deal with the new ideas, the different points of view. And the show was called Return, and it was opened by the Slovak Embassy. I was a one-woman show in a gallery. I was really nervous because I had normally painting and drawing and fiber arts in a more universal theme, and this was a very particular theme. This was our story, my dad, myself, and so I thought, well, will this be of interest to other people? But somehow, by telling that story, it opened the door for so many others, and stories began to pour out of people. And when I saw that, I realized there was a deep need in people to say, I'm here, look at me, this is who I am, this is my story, in a way to say, I matter, I have a place too. And so Quilt of Belonging was born out of that. I decided this couldn't be done with painting, because painting is the domain of a few people. But when you work with textile, we all wear it. We all express who we are, our geography, our history, the time that we live in. We mark our special occasions, and it's basic to our survival, like food. So textile was something that everybody could use. And the definition of textile in this case had to be very wide, because what people bring in their suitcase, you know, expressing who they are and what they're holding on to, may be made out of banana peels, it may be made out of bark, it may be made a miniature carpet, it could be silk, it could be a piece of family clothing, whatever, you know, it could be a teddy bear, you know, whatever. People that hang on to that, gives them that comfort, that sense of, this is who I am, this is a piece of the past that I need to cling to for whatever reason. This symbolizes my value and what's important to me.
Lou Sekalovsky and his sister Milka worked on the Macedonian bloc. He included precious parts of his family's history that his mother had brought to Canada.
This is the original one, actually, was worn by my mother on her wedding day with the bridal outfit. And on this, they put what we call the tokas, and let me just pick one. They're different styles, whether they're rectangular or round, or sorry, this one, again, with the coins at the bottom. It's all part of a decoration on the wardrobe. These roots, these tokens or symbols of identity are passed on from a generation to generation. And again, it's not something specific to the Macedonian people, but to all peoples throughout the world. That it's important. The parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents leave something to the new generation.
Your mom could have brought pots and pans and dishes, but what did she bring? She brought,
That's right.
you know, her wedding, pieces of her wedding gown, her dress. She bought the threads, and it's the thread that has carried her story, and which is why we were using textile to tell the story of humanity, because it is what people hold on to, and it expresses who they are.
The challenge was to design the quilt so that the textile blocks were connected in an inclusive way, while at the same time maintaining the distinctive cultural identity of each piece.
I was looking for a symbol that would express all of humanity, the essential being of humanity, because each one is going to tell their story. And so when I looked around and thought about it, the shape that really stood out for me was the hexagon shape. It's the most elemental shape in life. It's the shape of the carbon molecule from which all life is made. And when you put the hexagons together in nature, they form the beehive, which in actual fact is the strongest structure that exists. The strongest structure that we have in nature is that combination of hexagons. And so it became a really symbolic structure and grid for showing how do we put the pieces of humanity together to make something that's cohesive and that's really strong. Inside that hexagon, however, I've put a diamond shape, and that is the light colored piece on which people then get to tell their story. And they get to tell it in their own materials. I wanted to use the full spectrum of light, the color spectrum of the light spectrum, because that, again, is essential to life. So we had to be able to move through the color spectrum so that no matter who you were, where you were, you had kind of a glow and a unique quality to who you were. Matter of fact, some of the colors just did not exist and so needed to be painted or woven or overdyed or threaded, whatever it took to give you that band of color that moved all the way through the color spectrum, and to give that entire scope of humanity. Though this is called a quilt, it's not an ordinary quilt, and so the structure has been changed. The pieces are not butted one next to the other. In this piece, each piece is put separately on a background that holds it together. And the spacing between them is separated and connected both by winding wool that sits on top. It's a beautiful cording that borrows pieces and colors from one side and the other and joins them. It both frames the block so that each one has its own individual personality and is still can be seen on its own as a separate entity. At the same time, it ties them together with the neighbor. And it was an incredibly challenging task to find the right spacing. How far before one encroaches upon the other? How far before they seem like they're not touching or not in relationship one with the other? And it's a little bit like that in our society. We have to have a balance between our personal privileges and our community responsibility, realizing that everything that we do impacts our neighbor. And so we have to always have that dance between what's my space and what's common space, and how what I do impacts you. And maybe sometimes give and take a little. And the symbolism of that is really a statement about how we find a way to live together, even though we're very different one from another, and create that space of respect for each unique being.
The quilt volunteers reached far and wide across Canada to find an individual or a group from each nation of the world and from every Aboriginal group in Canada who would create a block about their culture. The volunteers took 46,000 hours and traveled over 215,000 kilometers, more than half the distance to the moon, to ensure that everyone was included, even if that person was the only individual from a tiny nation living in Canada.
We had to go to the United Nations and overseas and agencies, and Washington, if they didn't have embassy or representation or an association, we came to see the Canadian Ethnocultural Council, and they had contacts, but again, their contacts were spread, you know, fairly coast to coast, really, almost across Canada. So we just determined whatever it took, whatever was required, somebody was willing to go or to help out.
And so, Quilt of Belonging gradually came together, piece by piece, community by community, 263 blocks in total, 120 feet long and 10 feet high.
First row, the foundation row to the First Nations, that's where our story begins in Canada, with all our First Nations. So we have all our First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And they found their place of color in that border. And then the 3 rows above it are all the other cultures of the world that have come to Canada. And actually, as we have at least one person from every country of the world, we have the world in there. So the world sits next and builds upon those First Nations. And then the top is a band of color that is made of 1,200 separate pieces, and then the colors begin to interweave, because that's also part of our story. We marry somebody of a different culture or a different background, and we become a new story. And so that top border is the new story being created. Now, it's interesting that if you look really carefully at it, and like all art, there's often a lot of symbol in it, you'll notice that it's red on the 2 sides, that the Canadian block, which is a beautiful maple leaf that's been done with iridescent gold beads and fine gold thread, sits in the center. And if you put all the other colors together in the light spectrum, they make white. So in a sense, the whole 120 feet is like a very subtly done symbolic Canadian flag. When I decided to make the project, the way that I thought that we could show all of humanity was to have on the founding row all of our First Nations and Inuit and Métis, all our Aboriginal people. Their story needed to be told and respected. Now that right away took us from Newfoundland to Yellowknife and right across the country.
For Russell Roundpoint of the Akwesasne Mohawks of Cornwall Island on the St. Lawrence River, being part of the project helped educate people about First Nations living in Canada.
The quilt of belonging, if you think about it, a quilt is something that offers comfort and warmth and protection. So, you know, and the whole belonging part of it embraces the same philosophies that we have as Mohawk people, where there's an inclusiveness. And what better way to symbolize the fact that we are all here together in one place. There's no other earth, there is no other place that we can be. So we need to be wise enough to come together and to share what's there. There's an old Mohawk philosophy of one bowl, one spoon, and it really fits into what the quilt symbolizes. The fact that everyone is here together and is connected. A quilt is about connecting patterns and squares and in order to bring the unity that we need. And that's basically what Mohawk philosophy is about. Mohawks are a people of peace, and people don't seem to realize that. We are one of the few nations that really base our whole philosophy on the concept of the great law of peace, which is in actuality a reality for the Mohawks. Headlines will state otherwise, media portrayals, notwithstanding. Mohawks are about peace and the people about taking care of family, taking care of their neighbors, and being a good all-around citizen. I would like to see the people of Akwesasne and the Mohawk people, because there are more than one Mohawk community. Akwesasne is part of a larger nation. I would like to see us be prosperous, but not necessarily financially, but prosperous in our hearts and our minds, and to be able to have the riches of our culture more fully embraced than what it is. I think it's very important that children are able to be confident to go out into the world knowing where they come from, to know their heritage. The Mohawks primarily use the resources that were here, and that would be more along of skins, but basically they started using sweetgrass and other grasses to weave and to make patterns, and they would use clay and other materials.
The Cultural Center at Akwesasne encourages the community to learn and practice traditional Mohawk culture so that it is not forgotten.
If you don't carry on traditions like that, then as a people are left to guess what you are about.
For Tawana Miller and Barbara Littlebear, beadwork is an integral part of keeping First Nations culture alive. It is passed on from generation to generation.
Too, because I learned this from my great-grandmother, and now I've taught my daughter and I've taught my granddaughter, so you know it's going on and on and on. It hasn't stopped, so it's very fulfilling.
Yeah, my mother started teaching me how to do beadwork at the age of 11.
Okay.
And you know, she took her time out and brought me and my sister to all the different powwows, so we got to learn the dances and learn how to sing. The Seneca block that I created, there was the domes, which represents the sky dome between the sky dwellers and here on Earth, and I have the three spokes in the center, which represents corn, beans, and squash. It's not just about the sky, but everything that between the sky and the earth that grows on it.
Celine Mackenzie Vuxen is proud of the resourceful nature of her people, the Dog Rib, in the Northwest Territories, part of the Dene Nation. In creating her block, she used natural materials from the land.
I was able to use the caribou hide, and the challenging part about that was that I had to go to our community to find the caribou hide, and the rewarding part of it was that I also included my mother. Now that I think about it, she was a big part of it. We both share sort of a similar experience. I'm a second generation of residential school survivor. And my mother had gone to school too. So I wanted to put her sewing that she had given me into the block, and as well as tell her story. I went home to see my mother on the weekends. I would go home to my community in Fort Ray, that's what they used to be called, and I was working in Yellowknife. And I saw the beadwork that I grew up with, and I remembered how to bead. And I started beading a pair of mucklucks for myself.
As a young woman, Celine made the traditional footwear with the help of her mother. Mucklucks represent the traditional way of life and the ability to survive extreme cold. Celine passed her mucklucks on to her daughter, who wore them proudly as a symbol of the Dene people. Vicky Utpic, a fashion designer, uses traditional materials to make the kind of clothing which the Inuit have been wearing for centuries.
I'm from Huaktak, Nunavik. It's in northern Angava Bay, northern Nunavik. I chose sealskin because it's Inuit usual fur we use up north, and some leather just for background, and some embroidery on it that Inuit people use a lot to make designs.
Vicky believes it is important to make Inuit clothes using both modern sewing techniques and traditional hand sewing. She feels that it is equally important to create employment opportunities for her people. Her goal is to design clothing that can be made in sewing centers in Nunavik villages. The Inuit communities had the occasion to see Vicky's work and the Nunavik block when Quilt of Belonging traveled across the far north for 2.5 months. For volunteers and Inuit alike, it was a tour to be remembered. Quilt of Belonging has been exhibited across Canada and seen by 1.5 million people. Museums, galleries, and special events have taken every opportunity to show its magnificence and share its message.
Donc, j'ai reçu une invitation par la poste pour aller voir Fibre du Monde au Salon des métiers d'art, où l'œuvre était présentée durant tout le mois de décembre.
Michelle Boulanger is the executive director of the Abenaki Museum.
Et quand j'ai vu l'œuvre devant moi dans toute sa splendeur, les magnifiques couleurs, je suis restée bouche bée. Et tout de suite, j'ai essayé de convaincre Esther qu'elle devait être présentée au Musée des Abénaquis. La mission du Musée des Abénaquis est de faire découvrir la riche culture des Abénaquis entre nos visiteurs, mais également avec les gens de la communauté. Cette courte pointe-là représente l'image du Canada culturel, multiculturel tel que nous le connaissons aujourd'hui. Alors pour nous, cette courte pointe-là, cette œuvre-là va permettre à nos visiteurs d'engendrer un dialogue entre les nations, de faire découvrir qu'au Canada, il y a des Premières Nations, mais il y a également des nations immigrantes qui ont tissé et forgé le Canada d'aujourd'hui. Et ça, pour nous, c'est très important.
The exhibit at the Abenaki Museum has special meaning for Norm Shack. He has traced his ancestors to families who had settled in the area hundreds of years ago.
I'm even more thrilled because of the Abenaki background in my family, and for me, having participated in this, it's also another step in feeling all the closer to that Abenaki background. And you look at the whole range and see maybe the block you're most associated with. You see that the culture you were raised in is really one element of something that's much larger. And if we look at things through a lens of win-win rather than win-lose, we can see the richness that that brings. Of course, everybody is aware of the richness of cuisine. Nobody today would say, well, I'm only interested in what my mother cooked, but it goes well beyond that. It's the richness of literature, it's the richness of customs, and this is a visual display of the beauty and richness behind that for those who are accepting and feel that all these cultures contribute to the whole.
Norm was introduced to the quilt through his wife Jeanette when she worked with Saika Hinkie to create a block representing Brazil. Quilt of Belonging makes her feel part of a larger community in Canada.
And I think it also makes people realize this country and how it embraces all these people from all over the world. And we have that here. I think it's wonderful.
Claudette Voigt became interested and volunteered in the project precisely because of its message of acceptance of all people.
Le projet m'a toujours fascinée à cause du multiculturalisme. J'ai une fille qui a été dans une école où le multiculturalisme était très important et très présent parce qu'il y avait, c'était une école publique, mais dans un milieu où il y avait des Italiens, des Grecs, des Afghans, des Vietnamiens. Et on a toujours voulu donner à notre fille cette idée que il n'y a pas seulement des Canadiens et des Canadiens français, il y a vraiment tout un peuple, en fait un monde à découvrir. Et ça a toujours été pour moi une fascination. Les quelques fois que j'ai été exposée en fait à d'autres cultures, ça m'a vraiment comme frappée. Et c'est toujours resté avec moi. J'ai toujours été fascinée pour apprendre plus en fait au niveau de toutes les cultures du monde.
The importance of feeling included and welcomed as a newcomer and immigrant was something that Esther experienced personally during the making of the quilt.
When I was making this project, I was a landed immigrant. And so I got to look at it with fresh eyes. What does it mean to be part of this country? I had traveled a lot, gone back to Europe and seen what it had been like in communist world and how terrifying that had been because I had the stories from my family and I experienced some of it. So all of these things made me just realize what a privilege it is. I became a Canadian citizen myself. It's part of my story in making the project. I became part of this family. And it is a family that I treasure, and it is a great privilege.
Feeling included in the larger framework of a nation motivated Eric Lam, Angela Yick, and Judy Ginn to make the Chinese block to remind people about the Chinese community's long history in Canada.
We have Chinese community within Canada, started from the people coming here to build the national railways, and then progressing all the way down to the present days with different types of people and different types of backgrounds. And we came a long way to build up this community. And I'm very proud of our community that stretched from coast to coast to coast.
I think over, and then I decided with a dragon, because the symbol of dragon means China. China always. So I decided so many dragons. At last I find it the round one in the middle, and then 4 butterflies in the corners, and the water lily as well. Most of our Chinese like the dragon because dragon means luck.
Quilt is a start of something. I don't know what, but people will know this is very significant in the form of living together in some way.
Many people came to Canada with the dream of a better life. Owning a home symbolized belonging and the achievement of that dream.
Noi abbiamo lavorato forte, io e mio marito abbiamo lavorato forte. Una volta che avevamo la casetta avevamo tutto, perché in Italia non era facile avere una casetta facilmente. Per gli emigranti è una cosa importantissima. Questo simbolo della casetta è proprio importante per gli italiani. Chiunque ha una casetta è già contento.
Pierina Costanza and Carmela Buda stitched the house in the Italian block, representing a popular song in Italy in the 1950s, which symbolized the dream of owning a home and building a life in Canada.
Avevo mio marito che lui mi aiutava. Lui si metteva e faceva da mangiare, e allora io mi sedevo la mattina fino la sera a lavorare su questa casetta.
Questa è la casetta degli italiani in Canada. Ci sta la canzone? Avevo una casetta piccolina in Canada, con vasche e pesciolini e tanti fiori di là, e tutte le ragazze che passavano di là dicevano che bella la casetta in Canada. It's beautiful.
Rosalie Bernier used the delicate elements of nature to express her country's unique cultural beauty.
Alors, la Centrafrique est un pays spécial avec les papillons. Les gens, quand tu vois ça, ils pensent qu'on a détruit la nature. Mais non, mais c'est les papillons tombent comme la neige là au mois d'octobre-novembre parce qu'ils viennent de la grande forêt équatoriale dans le sud. Alors, les papillons ont juste une vie, 24 heures de vie d'un papillon, c'est pas lent. Alors, ils tombent et puis les ailes sont partout. Les enfants les ramassent et puis on fait plein de choses avec. Alors, c'est comme ça que mon frère a fait des choses, la scène, pour montrer la scène de la vie quotidienne, des bustes de femmes, des oiseaux, c'est tout ça. En tout cas, c'est vraiment, c'est ça que je voyais que ça représentait mon pays, c'est pour cela que je l'ai choisi. Dans mon pays, j'ai toujours été une fille très engagée. Et déjà très jeune, je faisais déjà partie du mouvement d'action catholique de l'enfance. Donc j'étais responsable des mouvements des jeunes. Et c'est à ce moment-là que les choses ont commencé à aller mal au pays. C'était un président qui a pris le pouvoir, puis petit à petit, la folie des grandeurs, il voulait se couronner comme empereur. Moi, quand j'étais chez moi, je voulais venir au Canada étudier. Et puis, il y a un Canadien qui est allé là-bas pour mettre un projet sur pied dans mon pays d'origine. Puis, finalement, c'est ce monsieur qui est devenu mon mari. Pour moi, c'est ça. C'est vrai que ça fait partie de l'appartenance. On appartient au Canada. Maintenant, on fait membre de la communauté du Canada. Mais le fait que On nous a mis tous ensemble sur le même pays d'égalité. Les pays pauvres comme les pays riches aussi. Le pays du tiers-monde comme là où je viens aussi. Par rapport à d'autres pays d'Europe, les gens qui ont vécu ici, là, pour moi, ça démontre encore que ce pays a une force qui vient de partout. Si les jeunes sont conscients que ce pays nous appartient à tous, ils feront attention aux autres, aux nouveaux arrivés, aux gens de différentes couleurs, parce que la terre nous appartient à tout le monde, mais le Canada vraiment est un pays spécial.
For Tatiana from Russia, Canada was a life-saving place, which accepted her family with her daughter, who had a rare life-threatening condition, the inability to absorb protein.
Canada gives us a hand. We received a special permission from Ministry of Health to come here, because usually countries not accepting families with handicapped kids. And we came here and we received such a warm greeting that till now I cannot hear the "Oh Canada" without tears in my eyes. Because this country gave my daughter a chance to survive and chance to live a full and healthy life, and gave us the chance to know other people, to have a second profession, to learn a lot about the world, and I felt like I belong to this society. It's very difficult to wiggle your way somewhere in society when you're just coming in, 40 years old. It's difficult. First of all, we joined the church and met with the church community. Then we joined the small Russian society, and then you came with your project, which made my world really bigger. And I'm so glad that you let me participate in this project. I met other people who's very genuine. They are not real artists, but they have a feeling that they have to deliver something what they feel about their nation. And this work bonded me and let me understand the Canadian society better through the people, through their work.
Some of the block makers came from war-torn countries. Their participation in the project was a way of sharing the beautiful and peaceful nature of their cultural heritage and homeland, the portion that is often overshadowed by conflicts. Their stories tell of loss and healing and the rebuilding of their lives.
We left Iraq for political problems, with what was Saddam Hussein and the war. We want to be safe. So we came here just to live in a peaceful country, away from all the war, away from all the trouble. Lots of people, of course, we lost during those wars, because it's not only the war with Iran, then the war with the Gulf, the Gulf War. Not a lot of people, they know a lot about Iraq, actually. So that's why I wanted in this project to show the good face of Iraq. So that if you go to Iraq and they show you the museums, what we have from civilization, the good people, the universities, those educated people of Iraq, at that time they'll know what is Iraq. I chose that piece because it has a few stuff from my country. Black, that we call the black color, it's a symbol of the oil, and those the golden stuff, the wheat. Although it's back home, we say back home it's our country, I think, but still, Canada is we can't live without Canada anymore. Yeah.
Marta Viscara was once a social activist in El Salvador. She worked with her sister to help poor women and inform them of their rights. This was during the turbulent 1980s.
Moi, je suis de formation travailleuse sociale. Au Salvador, j'ai travaillé de ça. Mais à partir de mon travail, de mon engagement en tant que travailleuse sociale, moi, j'ai travaillé avec des femmes. beaucoup de femmes qui avaient besoin de les faire connaître ses droits. Alors, à ce moment-là, à mon pays, il y avait la guerre. Il y avait une guerre civile que ça coûtait à peu près 90 000 morts et beaucoup d'exilés, beaucoup de disparus aussi. Alors, quand moi j'ai travaillé avec les femmes, et c'était comme un problème pour l'armée. Ils ne voulaient pas qu'on parlait de rien de développement pour les gens. Alors, quand moi j'étais en train de travailler, et ils sont allés me chercher pour m'emprisonner. Il y avait une institution qui s'appelait la Garde nationale. Alors, j'étais à la Garde nationale, c'est seulement que j'étais en qualité de disparu. Alors, tandis que les gens ne me trouvaient pas, la Garde nationale ils pouvaient me faire toutes sortes de blessures, des coupes électriques, des frappes, toutes sortes de choses. Et normalement, si on était emprisonné, disparu, on ne pouvait pas s'en sortir vivante. Mais comme je dis, c'est merci à ma mère, merci à ma famille, à des amis qui se sont communiqués avec beaucoup de monde et pour comme ça qu'ils m'ont trouvé dans telle prison. Mais après ça, il y avait ma famille qui m'a dit non, c'est mieux que tu quittes le pays parce que tu ne peux pas rester ici. Ils m'ont donné refuge au Canada.
Marta has devoted her life here in Canada to helping others, and though she still remembers those terrible times, she created a block representing positive memories of everyday life back in El Salvador.
On voulait faire quelque chose qui nous représentait. C'est quelque chose pas exotique, mais c'est un peu quelque chose qui parle de notre vie. Malgré qu'on a vécu la guerre, malgré qu'on est pauvre, malgré qu'on a beaucoup de difficultés, on est un peuple vraiment joyeux. Les petits morceaux qu'on a fait, c'est une partie de toute la globalité qu'on a au Canada, mais que c'est là qu'on peut regarder toute la différence qu'on a.
The quilt is a collection of cultural differences that are threaded together by common values, compassion, and the desire for a better world. These core values are what Ketley Hamilton dreams of for her people in Haiti.
Collaboration, amour, fraternité, le sérieux dans ce qu'on fait. Donc tout ce qu'il y a de bon ici au Canada ou en Argentine ou en Europe, c'est ce que je voudrais voir pour tous les Haïtiens, pour tout le monde.
The making of the quilt took many years of dedicated work by volunteers, community groups, donors, thousands of ordinary people, each contributing in his or her own way. The quilt has traveled across the country from Newfoundland to British Columbia. It has crossed the far north from Labrador to Yellowknife. After each exhibit, it is curated and carefully stored by volunteers, not knowing where and how it will continue on its unique journey. A journey which, like the making of the quilt, relies on faith and hope.
From an artistic point of view, the stepping outside of the traditional box of how things are done and what's possible that way, of being able to make a project without somebody just giving you the money and saying, here it is, you can do it, and if I don't have it, I don't do it, of starting out and walking in faith piece by piece and persevering. There's a lot of lessons to be gained that way.
The most important message that the Quilt team wants to share is the message that belonging is a fundamental need of each human being, that there needs to be a valued place for everyone in our world. The dream of the project is to inspire, to develop compassion and respect for others, and to give people hope in a personal way, to move individuals, communities, and society towards positive change.
The real quilt that's being woven here is the human quilt. It's the relationship. It's the invisible tapestry of humanity. It was our dream and our vision that this would show or tell people that there's still a possibility in the world. I think sometimes we lose hope. We see the troubles and the wars and the things that happen and the greed, and we're bombarded with it, and we think this is the way it's always going to be or has to be. This is a reminder to people that it doesn't have to be that way. But the way to change it is not waiting for a politician or a symposium to decree that the world is going to be different. The way that happens is from the bottom up. It happens with ordinary people like you and I, piece by piece, how I treat my neighbor, how my child treats her fellow students, the compassion we have for our fellow worker, how I treat you today, what I give you, if I listen to you, if I care about you in a real way, in a down-to-earth, practical way, that's what's going to change the world.
Thank you so much for hanging out with us tonight to watch that film. I had some really some of my favorite moments in that film are when the two, I call them the nonas, the Italian woman starts singing. It just kind of makes you emotional. But there's so many emotional moments in that film. Yes, thank you everyone saying what a beautiful story, beautiful, wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity. We do have some questions, so I'm so glad that Esther's here to answer your questions live and to be here in this moment with you live, because I think even every time someone watches the documentary and understands the story behind the quilt and what it stands for and all of those stories, it changes us a little bit and it changes our perspective. And so I'm really glad you guys all got to experience that. So Esther, let me unmute you here and bring you on out. So can we hear her?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, so how does it feel for you to watch the documentary again and to go through and experience all of that again?
It's very emotional because in the making of the quilt, these became friends. These are people that we still talk, we still see each other from time to time. And what you see is just the tip of the story, just the tip of the iceberg. In the making of a quilt, you spend a lot of time together and you get to know these people. I miss some of them, but some of their stories still move me. I think, wow, you have no idea, and I have no idea what some people have gone through and continue to go through, how really courageous they are. And it's very humbling to see and they don't come out angry or bitter so often. They have come out and ready to help and pitch in, and I just find that incredible.
Yeah, it's when you have that perspective of the woman that was put in jail for help teaching women about their rights, or all these situations that people were dealing with that we over here we sometimes take for granted. all of the amazing blessings that we do have. So
well,
I wanted to
in a situation, for example, working with her, while we were working on the quilt one day, there's hundreds of stories behind the stories. When I was working with her one day in her house, I noticed that people were coming into her house, which was very modest, tiny apartment. And they would open the cupboard doors and they would help themselves and walk out. And finally, I said to her, do you know somebody's in your kitchen? Oh, that's okay. She said, they need it more than me. So even then, with the little bit that she had, she was still sharing. She was trying. She had been very damaged by the electric shock and the torture, but she was still doing embroidery so that she could sell it at little bazaars and things at church, so she'd have money to give for people. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's definitely, and you just think about how many blocks there are, those 263 blocks and all those stories behind the stories and stories impacted by the stories, and just this huge ripple effect of the quilt. Deb Howard asked, how did you choose the people to do each block?
We did not hold any competition, because that goes against what we were trying to say. So what we did is, if anybody came forward and wanted to make a block and there was nobody else working on it, we'd say, okay, you can do it. If there were others, then we tried to bring them into the group that was making and find a place for them. The idea was that in the making of it, there had to be a place for all. And then, of course, many times we just had to go out and do some arm twisting, because it was hard to convince a lot of people that this crazy outside the box idea was going to work. And much to my surprise, some of the volunteers that stuck it out all those years didn't tell me until it opened at the Museum of Civilizations that they really had their doubts it would ever come to be. I kept saying, well, why did you stay? So that, it is that, it's all of that. So it was just working together, and if helping one another. A block maker might be missing materials. They might be not knowing. We actually taught one or two of the people how to sew because they wanted to make their own blocks. Sometimes they needed help drawing their ideas or design. So it was about enabling people to tell their story, whether they were a professional artist or just a beginner. Somehow we got there.
Yeah, definitely a huge project. We had someone ask, well, I know I had a question. I was wondering, where's the furthest place that the quilt has been displayed?
Oh, we were chosen for the World Commonwealth Conference in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. The president of Malaysia brought the quilt in for this world conference. So, and right, of course, when the two Malayan airplanes were downed, but we had some intrepid volunteers and they said, we're going, so they did.
Wow, yeah, the volunteers are a huge part. I remember when Patricia and our volunteers and our staff set this up, and we could not have done it with just a few people. It really needed all hands on deck. And yeah, actually, Patricia, did you want to jump out here and just share some of your comments and maybe a question you have for Esther after watching the documentary?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, every time I see the film, it always brings up different, connotations that trigger things that I think about, and I'm always amazed at the beauty of the quilt blocks themselves, and the opportunity to celebrate the similarities and differences from nation to nation, and how it becomes an acceptance of all people. But then you start tugging at those threads, and how things unravel in a sense about talking about those atrocities and, you know, all those isms that exist today. And I think in the art world, beauty sometimes gets a bad rap, you know. Same with, you know, kind of like the whole history of art, you know, like, you know, for a long time, like textile work wasn't considered like as an art form. It was like a craft or, you know, an artisan sort of skill. And you know, I just think that when it comes back down to it, it is about humanity, and every one of us has a story to tell. And I'm always amazed at how textile does cross over those artistic practices. And Esther, we talked just briefly at the beginning about that, so maybe you could comment on that again, on how photography, how the writers, and how that kind of takes on that transition.
Well, part of that, it's interesting that you brought up the idea of textile, and part of the project in here is where is that line between craft and art. And we have very sometimes elitist ideas of who's an artist. It's interesting because when we started to study, for example, some of the tiles or some of the embroidery designs from some of the nations, they are amazingly complex, and they have an unerring sense of composition and color and the elements of art, for example, in some of the carpets. And so, of course, I got to see a lot more work than you see in a small block, because the first thing most of the block makers did was pull out all their stuff. And often it was a lot, or if it was an association and everybody brought, you know, all the Norwegian embroidery would fill a museum that came out. Now where do we start? How do you make a block? It's only 9 by 9 out of all of this. And of course, with the textiles, the story. Somebody asked me, I see on the chat line, they asked me, would I do this again? Well, the answer is in a heartbeat, yes. I would. But I'm really glad I did not know all the challenges that lay ahead. Very often, as you start a project, you have a dream, and I could see it finished in my head. If I had known how hard it would be, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to start. But the thing that held me is that I knew I was meant to do it. I knew that project, that I was called to do that. I stood back for a year and fought with myself and with God and whoever else about whether I should start it or not, because I knew it was going to be so huge. And it wasn't involving just me. When you take somebody along on a ride like that, you can't just quit when it gets too hard and they've already put in a year or two working on it with you. So it was piece by piece, and the challenges were there, but we were able to keep going. Would I do a project again? I've been often asked for a sequel, or is there something else? If there was something that I felt that strongly about, I would. But I wouldn't do a project just to make it the biggest, the most complicated, the most whatever, because it isn't about me or the Guinness Book of Records. We were often asked, were we going to put that in it? It was never about that. It was about being as faithful to humanity and to people as we could be. And so if I was ever something that needed doing again, yes, I would. But I wasn't doing it alone. First of all, my faith carried me a good chunk of the way. I knew that I couldn't let it go. Also, I couldn't let my dad down. My dad told me that in no uncertain terms I was never to quit. And I would have to answer to him for that. But it's the people and the heart that they put in. It meant so much to each of the individuals. You can't let them down. So you have to struggle through. And we did have a lot of challenges, that's for sure. Somebody also asked me, are there stories to tell? I've often been asked to tell this, to write a book on the making of it. For every story that you see there are hundreds of behind the scenes, some of them that can't be shared, but many, just in finding people and working with them and their lives, what's happening, where are they 20 years later, and what's happened to them. So that's the real joy of it.
Yeah, that would be interesting, like an update documentary of the block makers now. I wanted to address one of the questions that came in, or one of the comments rather, from Fran about a quilt about the Indian residential school system. Interesting that she says that. We'll actually talk about one of our next exhibitions with the witness blanket. That's extremely powerful. But one of the things I wanted to bring to light, because there is a lot of, even in the chat has come up with some of the current situations that are happening with the land back and with the Wet'suwet'en and with the Indigenous people of Canada. And I found it very, very compelling that the basis of the quilt, the foundational blocks of that quilt were dedicated to the Indigenous nations, and maybe just talking a little bit about that and addressing that, because that can bring up certain feelings in people.
Oh, and I've answered many of those feelings as I've met, and that 1.5 million that was there is now well over 3 million that have seen it. I wanted to answer one comment that I said, and it's a shame that the First Nation or the First Peoples, because First Nation is just a portion of our First Peoples, that the atrocities weren't mentioned in fact. And in the actual fact, they do take place in the quilt. If you look at the Beatuk block, it represents the genocide. It was done in memoriam, because in actual fact, they were exterminated, or we thought that they were exterminated. There was at one time an actual bounty on people's on their heads that they would get, and so they were exterminated partly by disease, but partly by genocide. And the symbolism is not lost on there. Matter of fact, when we were doing that first row, it took us almost a full 6 years to determine what all the groupings were, the major groupings in Canada. We worked with the Department of Indian Affairs, the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, the Métis organization, the treaty makers, the Grand Chiefs. Oh, it was a huge process. We were afraid to get it wrong. And the stories did come out. It's interesting, though, even when you see the Iraqi woman and things, they talk about the atrocities. They don't show them in the block. I asked some of them, why not? Because that's something that happened to us. We want to show that we are good people, the best of what we are. So some of that happened in the First Peoples blocks as well. They wanted to show what they could be proud of, not a period of history that has happened to them. However, the fact that we did that Beatuk block and told the story truthfully is one of the reasons that many of the First Nation block makers agreed to be part of the quilt, because they have been so maligned and their stories wrongfully told and hurt, that they would often say to me, and why should we help you, after what you've done to us? And so it took years to win that confidence, but very often they pointed to that Beatuk block and they said, you told the truth there, so we will trust you now. So it's not that we were hiding that, but even the others, they chose. I found that very interesting, because there were terrible things going on in a lot of the countries, and some of the women that I was working with would lift their skirts and show me their machete wounds, or talk about their rape, or all these things, but they didn't portray that, because they felt they were portraying the beauty of their people. They wanted people to look at them and say, isn't that wonderful? That's the part that they chose to show, even though they would talk about the other things maybe in a more private context.
Yeah, it is really beautiful, and it's interesting to include that tribe, and you can learn more about it. Like I said, I think it was it Jane said that anyone can watch that documentary as well on your website. And the companion book, you can actually get the companion book and pick it up at Woodland. And I love flipping through like I could get lost in that book when I'm just reading and matching and going through, and I always, it's fascinating to me. But yes, very, very powerful. So yeah, I love that concept of the first rows belonging to the First Nation, the First Peoples of Canada, really. I have Elizabeth, or is it Elizabeth? I think it's Elizabeth Sunham. She says she's opening an outdoor school in September, in a couple of weeks, and she's really trying to try this idea, maybe on a smaller scale. So she's wondering if there's a way to approach it with the kids. So maybe you could talk about that, and also talk about some of the teachers' resources that you have with the quilt.
We have been asked that many times, and many schools, universities, different places have used the quilt to build community in the school. Particularly, schools are increasingly seeing multicultural populations within the schools, and sometimes therefore tensions and things like that. So we have put online how to do your own quilt of belonging. We are here to mentor them. We've put all our resources for free. So we don't want people or schools to say that they can't afford that, because we know that budgets are tight and the have and have not. So we worked really hard. All our resources are online, free for anybody. But if you contact us and we can help, we will do everything we can. And if it's within traveling distance, we've gone to schools, we've sent materials. We just really are delighted that educators want to use, to teach the next generation these values. We think it's super important that the next generation place a great deal of value on that. So I think it's wonderful, Elizabeth. I just think, and don't hesitate to call or email or text. I will answer. I'll be there.
Awesome. And Elizabeth said she got the book and she got the DVD from Woodland's website. So that's awesome. Thank you so much. We're glad that, and again, we have some of those resources. We've linked to her page from our website if you can't find them, but Google is amazing. I have one more question. Deb asks, where does the quilt stay when the displays are over?
Well, we are a traveling exhibition. And like you saw in the film, everybody in a small community helps. So it turns out that it's too big a project to stick in somebody's garage or basement, and it's very precious. So we have had on the board and have a supporter who is president of a sonar equipment company, and they work often with high secret installations, military, around the world, in the Middle East, everywhere. So they have a loading dock. They give us storage, which is high security, and so it lives in a sonar company until it heads out again. And then when we want to curate it, which we do once or twice a year, a volunteer trucks it over to a church, which allows us to use their big hall. And you saw that in the film somewhere unrolling. We were curating it. And we stretch out all the tables, and matter of fact, we've even had it hanging over the pews once because there was something. So we kind of have to think out of the box. But if part of the story too is if we can do something this size of ordinary people, then just think of the potential that exists in Canada, in your city, in the world, if a lot of people got together. So that's what happens. And someday we are hoping for a permanent home. We've been working on that, but every time we think it's going to stop traveling, the requests still coming in. So we've decided we will go, and as you can see a little bit in the film, sometimes it's the huge museums, the Winnipeg Art Gallery or something else like that. Sometimes it's large, it's conventions, the UNESCO World Conference, the members of parliament and the Senate had a private showing. Sometimes it's a weekend, sometimes it's 6 months, or that World Conference. So we go where we feel it is needed. And when we crossed the Arctic, it bounced on the back of a Kamatik and a Skidoo, and we have taken some risks. It has not stayed perfectly safe in the art world, but it wasn't made to do that. So that's a conscious choice that we made. We would go where it could best serve people, small or big.
Well, I know that I can't wait for us to be able to open again. I know I get to walk in there and take pictures to try and somehow get the message out there of the quilt. But it's like, I feel like every place I've seen it a few different places. It's kind of a different experience. And one of the things that I love about how it is in Woodland, at the Woodland Cultural Center, is it feels like a hug. I feel like I walk into it and I'm surrounded by this warm hug of color and beauty and beading and textiles and fabrics and stories.
We knew from the beginning that if it was going to go out, you can't expect to take 120 feet and I don't know how many volunteers to sit and hold it up 10 feet in the air while somebody nails it into the wall. So we designed it with a local MacGyver. He's actually an inventor genius kind of young fellow. And we designed it so that it, as you know, it has rotating heads so it can shape itself. So at the Woodlands, it's almost, yes, it wraps the room. There's other times when it's stretched out, like when we were at the G20. We were the centerpiece for the G20 conference in the interior of in Toronto, and it was a long sweep, and it gives a very different effect. There's not a right or wrong, it's just you're right. It feels different. We've had it in an S. We had a big wave when it was the centerpiece for the Canada's 150 at Ottawa City Hall, and it just happened to be the way the Grand Hall was, and so we kind of adjust it, and every place is kind of unique.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone that has stayed with us and joined and asked your questions and left your beautiful comments. People are extremely moved, and we can't wait to open our doors again to invite you to come and see the Quilt of Belonging at Woodland Cultural Center. So I think, unless you wanted to say anything just to wrap it up, Patricia?
I just want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and just come and enjoy the quilt and celebrate it, and appreciate each day as it comes, and appreciate each other. And yeah, that's my wish.
Absolutely.
Mine
so
too.
Thank you so much. We in the Mohawk language, which is one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, they don't actually have a word for goodbye. They just say onegoahi, which kind of means see you later or see you soon. So we can't wait to see you again at the Woodland Cultural Center, and make sure to stay plugged in for some of our other virtual events that are coming up. And we have some of real life events that are actually coming up, which we're really excited about, with the Unplugged session on with our musical, celebrating our musical artists. So that's going to be amazing. So stay plugged in for that. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Dobry wieczór.